Hey everyone, welcome to another live session. This is a bit unplanned, unscripted one today because it's just been a bit hectic. Things are getting busy on this end. So thanks everyone for your messages. I've lost some friends over the course of this month unexpectedly. Yeah, and it's for those who are sending condolence messages and so on. Thank you so much for that. I've been open about haven't been open about who I'm talking about, but I've been open about that. There's been a lot of death around recently, and I think some of that is preventable. So first of all, thanks for that. In terms of what I wanted to talk about today, so we are in about halfway through the month of Ramadan, looking at the moon. So Assalamu alaikum to all my Muslim friends and followers. So fasting, I just want to point out maybe what most of us know or what many of us will know, which is that fasting has become very popular in recent years. But most of what we know, if not all of what we know about fasting, is from the experiments done on Muslims during the month of Ramadan. And there's lots and lots of data on this. The data is of sort of mixed quality, people say. So, some meta reviews say that the data isn't good enough to make firm conclusions, but it's all indicates similar things, right? Which is the things that most of us already know. Fasting is good for weight loss. Fasting is good for improving metabolic profiles. Fasting is good for reducing blood sugars and so on. Most of us already know this. But what I want to talk about today, just very briefly, is why fasting is so important when we're talking about autoimmune diseases, when we're talking about heart health, which in my view is also kind of like heart disease is also kind of an autoimmune disease. I'll talk about that in detail some other time. But why is it so important? So, fasting is important because when we think about the immune system overall, we think about how much of the immune system is actually in our gut. And the answer is that most of it is. Again, depending on how you estimate it, you're going to get different figures. Is no one answer to most of these questions. But let's say, for the sake of argument, roughly 70% of the immune system is located in the gut. Okay. Now, first of all, the question would be, why is 70% of the immune system in our gut? Well, the answer is because we keep on eating funny things. We eat things, that may or may not be good for us. We eat things that may or may not be toxic. We eat things that may or may not trigger an allergy, right? And so the immune system has to be there to sort of filter out what's good and what's not, what's needed, right? What the immune system would do ideally is just take the nutrients that it recognizes that are good for us and let those pass through the intestinal system. So that's what we would like it to do. But unfortunately, we do things that confuse our immune system. We do things that confuse our intestines, right? And we're also eating foods that may or may not be appropriate for humans. We're eating diets that were developed 10,000 years ago at the very earliest. Most of our diets were developed less than that, 100 years ago or less. If you're having things like ice cream and cakes and cookies and seed oils, and these are things that really didn't exist in any significant quantities even 200 or 300 years ago, right? So because we're doing that and we're eating them constantly, if you grew up in my generation, you were given advice to eat 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times a day. I've seen in some of those old diet books. So you were constantly bombarding your immune system with all of these things. And the result is that the immune system in the gut is just overactivated. It's always turned on. It's always doing something. And if the immune system is always focusing on what's in the gut, then it has very little time for cleaning up the rest of the body. It has very little time for cleaning up the brain. And if the immune system doesn't function properly in the brain, we get Alzheimer's. It has very little time for cleaning up the heart. And if the immune system doesn't function properly in the heart, we get coronary artery disease. We get other things too, right? In the whole vascular system, we get problems. So it's important that we give our immune system time to recover. Now, what does time to recover mean? It means fasting. Now, all of us fast because we're not eating for the time that we're sleeping, for example, we're not eating. That is very important. And it's important just at the very minimum to lengthen that time that we're not having a meal. It's important at the very minimum to, say, not eat within an hour of waking up or within a couple of hours of sleeping. That's a sort of bare minimum. But I think what most of us can benefit from is just taking a little bit longer. So if you're Muslim, you have the advantage that actually it's prescribed for a whole month. Actually, we're also in the Christian month of fasting, Lent. Um, of course, Jews also have fasting. Pretty much every religion has fasting as a component. That's another indication that we should actually be giving this custom maybe more importance than most of us do. So the bare minimum, you want to increase the amount of time before you have your breakfast and after you have your dinner, the time when you're not eating. And what I recommend for most of my clients, even young people, even teenagers, we do this with, at a bare minimum, let's say 12 to 14 hours of fasting time. So that leaves 10 to 12 hours of time when you can have food, right? That's a sort of bare minimum. What would be a step up from that? Well, a step up from that to me is a daily routine where you're compressing your meals within a certain window. And for most people, for most adults, so this is not advice for children and for teenagers, or even for people in their 20s, but say if you're 30 or above, we would say, look, 2 meals a day is kind of the maximum. You can gain weight. If you're underweight, you can easily gain weight with 2 meals a day. Um, but there's no reason that you shouldn't have a larger fasting window for most people, and most people will see benefits, right? So 2 meals a day between a like 18-6 or a 16-8. So that means 18 hours of fasting, 6 hours of eating, or 16 hours of fasting, 8 hours of eating. And when I'm talking about the eating window, of course, you're not eating like all the time during those 8 hours. You're having 2 meals, usually one lunch and one dinner. So if you have at lunch at say 11 and dinner at say 6, that's fitting within that window, that kind of 16-8 kind of window. So that's a step up. Now, what's a step up even from that? I think the advantages to having a longer fast periodically, not very often necessarily, but longer than 24 hours is important, at least sometimes. So again, this has to do with body's repair system. That has to do with cleaning up the brain, cleaning up the artery, allowing for those things to happen. And what I'll also say is that these things sometimes are not easy to measure. And because they're not easy to measure, people can sometimes go too far. And that's why we have people, as I've talked about in other videos, we have people like Rhonda Patrick and Peter Attia, people who used to be huge fans of fasting and now don't do it so much. But those guys kind of took it to an extreme. Like you look at Peter Attia, he was fasting every day. He was fasting once a week. He was fasting several days, 5 to 7 day fasts every 3 months. I mean, that's a little crazy. That's a little excessive. And he was losing muscle mass as a result of that, and he could measure that. But I would say that unless you're going to that kind of an extreme, muscle loss is probably not a concern. So again, we find people who are able to even gain weight when they are doing some degree of fasting. So if they need to gain weight, and so again, if you suffer from an autoimmune disease, anything Hashimoto's thyroiditis, vitiligo like myself, asthma like myself. Asthma is not exactly an autoimmune disease, but it's kind of in that same thing. Or the more serious ones, things like lupus, things like multiple sclerosis, and so on. Taking the fast seriously is a really good idea, and doing them for a longer period of time. So I think that's about it for today. I just wanted to remind everyone that we are in Ramadan, that the Muslims amongst us are fasting, and if you wanted to join them, if you're doing it, that's great. What I'll say is that the Muslim way of fasting also includes abstention from water. So therefore, it's probably important not to do that for too long, not to do that kind of fasting for more than 16, 18 hours. Although it probably is safe for most people to do it a little bit longer than that, but it's not necessary. But if you're not fasting in the Muslim tradition, you can have water, non-caloric beverages. Some of us even have like cream in the coffee. It's not going to mess up things too badly. If you just stick to a little bit of even a little bit of protein is no big deal, but a little bit of high fat cream, as I say in the coffee, is going to be fine for most people. So I wouldn't stress too much about it. The important thing is you're not eating. You're giving that immune system time to renew, time to regenerate, time to recover. And that's really where we see a lot of benefits from fasting. So just some thoughts today as we are near the midway point. In fact, we may be past the midway point in Ramadan. Thanks so much. Let me know in the comments, what do what kind of fasting are you practicing? If you're practicing any, would you like to give a fast a try? What kind of fast are you thinking of trying? Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.